if your sodium levels are low, what your body will do is it'll artificially raise up its insulin in order to help you retain water. So what this does is it makes you hungrier, because when your insulin's up, you're hungrier. It also turns off fat burning. That's what insulin does. It's an anabolic hormone. It wants to build things, and it turns off any catabolic processes like fat burning. Hey there, my name is Anthony Romano, and I'm going to tell you a very easy trick that you can do on any fat loss diet to feel less hungry, right? To have easier, more subdued appetite without having to eat anything. Works on any diet, like I said, very easy, very cheap, no gimmicky supplement I'm selling. And essentially, this can also help your well-being. It can help your sanity if you're on very low calories or if you're on a very volatile blood sugar spiking diet. But this is such an easy trick, and nobody really talks about it unless they're in the keto fasting community. But I'll tell you what it is and how it works and how it differs for different diets. But essentially what this is drinking salt water. So there's a specific type, which I'll explain after I roll my intro. So, how is drinking salt water in any way going to benefit you on a fat loss diet or a low calorie diet? Or a low carb diet for that matter? Well, this is part of my Any Diet playlist on YouTube, so you can watch that for tips on any diet, stuff that applies to almost every fat loss diet. And what salt water, so electrolytes, right? I'm going to explain which ones in a moment. What it will do, okay? It'll do slightly different things depending on what your diet looks like. So I'll explain that in a moment, and don't just take this advice and start pounding back salt water, because if you have too much in the wrong kinds, you'll shit yourself because you'll start activating what's called a salt flush. So don't do that, and let me explain. So you never want to have too much salt, and because that can be problematic for, salt flushing reasons, but having not enough salt can affect your levels of hydration. And everybody kind of looks at hydration as like, oh, drink whatever many cups of water or whatever, right? But if you realize there's an equalizing effect with everything in the body, and if you drink too much water, you'll start pissing a lot of it out. Essentially, that's your body balancing the amount of water it has. I mean, it's common sense. We all know this, right? So there's this kind of other element of how much water you hang on to, how much water gets distributed to your organs or essentially used by other functions of your body besides just, going in, going out. And here to start off, because before I explain how this applies to every diet, I'm going to explain how it applies to a ketogenic diet or fasting, just because that will give you an understanding of the mechanisms. So on a ketogenic diet, which I am a very big fan of, been doing for longer than 7 years now, when you are not eating carbohydrates, salt, so sodium, is really your only way of retaining water from food sources, right? Because carbohydrates will retain water, but when you're not eating them, you have to get that water retention from another source, being sodium. And if you're fasting, you may have definitely heard about the whole salt water thing through snake juice, right? That's what they call it in the fasting community because of Cole Robinson, who is, I have to give credit for, is basically the originator of using snake juice. So like some people call it keto salt water, sodium, potassium, right? Those other types of drinks, right? Or a lot of runners use it too, a lot of other cyclists. A lot of athletes use this stuff. But I'm going to give credit to Cole Robinson here because he has great videos and, he talks a lot about prolonged fasting. So if you don't know what this is essentially fasting for days on end. Anything longer than a day is prolonged fasting territory. Anything shorter than a day is intermittent fasting territory. And so example, for the keto dieting, you can benefit by having some salt water, right, of this particular mix, which I'll explain later in the video, because it will replenish your electrolytes without making you deplete other ones, and you'll get that water retention effect. You can have better performance, you'll have better hydration going on in many parts of your body, right? Especially because these are essential minerals that we need, right? So drinking this salt water mixture, which I'll explain, has obvious benefits in the keto diet context. And when you're doing a prolonged fast, you generally require more of these electrolytes in the water because fasting is technically a ketogenic diet, except you're not eating anything, right? Ketogenic diet simply means you're not eating carbs or sugar. So it doesn't mean you have to eat high fat or low protein or whatever. It just means don't eat carbs. If you're not eating anything, you're in a keto state because you're not eating carbs still, in addition to not eating anything. Your body will be in a keto state whether you like it or not if you're not eating carbs. And how deep that state is a different question. But not eating anything gets you into the deepest level of ketosis possible, which is the fasted state. And this is ultimately where you're going to need more sodium and electrolytes and a higher dose of this salt water in order to retain water and get the benefits of these essential minerals. Now that you have an understanding of how the whole water retention effect works out, I'm going to explain to you how the salt water thing plays into any diet and how it also affects hypertensive issues, blood pressure, etc. And also dosing. So back to the theory here. For any diet, right? A carbohydrate-based low-calorie diet is what I mean by that. So if you're doing any sort of low-calorie diet, right, you're probably going to have, if you're including carbohydrates on a carb metabolism, you're going to have this volatile blood sugar spiking going on. That's going to happen as well with your insulin, unless you're fasting or cramming this into a shorter eating window. So, this is ultimately another reason why I find keto dieting and fasting far superior as a physique maintenance tool, simply because it's so much easier than going to sleep clawing at my walls because I'm hungry and I'm doing it if it's your macro diet. So hey, if you enjoy that, that's fine. But in my experience, every time I do an if it fits your macro diet, there's this inevitable point where you start under fueling your body because it's still on a carb metabolism, but you're not really able to give it enough carbs as it wants. So for me, I prefer to just switch entirely to keto, and that's what I've done years and years ago. And I've never looked back because it's far better and I feel better. I perform better and mentally I feel a lot sharper. And of course it has other benefits to, your health, detoxifying, sensitizing you to carbs in a beneficial way and fats as a easy fuel to use. Better quality fuel, which is topic for other videos. But back to the whole salt water thing, okay? On a carb diet. Now, in this specific case, you don't want to mix very high salt amount and very high carb amount. There's a book I've read by Dr. James DiNicolantonio called The Salt Fix. And this gave me quite a lot of insight into how to use salt where does salt belong in a healthy lifestyle, right? So, a lot of people tend to think too much salt, too much sodium will give you hypertensive issues. To give you the, skinny details on this, right? Because I could list a bunch of random studies, but I'll direct you to that book if you want a list of endless studies on how salt isn't really the problem for hypertension. But a lot of the time, salt has been given a bad rap for what sugar has been doing, or at the least, high sugar, high processed sugar, and then adding in more salt on top. That tends to be what actually leads to hypertensive issues and high blood pressure issues. So a lot of times doctors will, have erroneously, based off science of years and years and years of not isolating for these ketogenic diet variables or settings where people's water retention was already lower, right? Because that's kind of part of why I gave you this context of keto, because you have to know this in order to grasp the concepts. A lot of science up until this point has looked at what happens when you increase sodium, but it doesn't look at that across a wide variety of scenarios. It doesn't look across of, what if the people aren't eating carbs, right? It simply just added in sodium to what was the normal diet through years and years and years, and it's sometimes led to problems, sometimes hasn't. And the only times, and the main, deduction from that book, The Salt Fix, is that, adding in salt can only be problematic in times of people who are already having a shitload of processed sugar, okay? So even on its own, even if you're not having a bunch of processed sugar, then extra salt might not be a problem for you. But for people who are already hypertensive or already eating a load of crap, that's when extra salt can be a problem for you, okay? So in that, if you fall into those categories, maybe don't use this saltwater trick. But for anybody who's eating, who's already in not detrimental or risky health, you can use this trick to kind of blunt your appetite and make you feel better during, a diet of any sort, a low-calorie diet. So how does this fit into, besides the fact that we know, adding a bit of extra salt isn't going to make your heart explode or your arteries burst unless you're already eating like crap, or if you have a lot of hypertensive issues already. What oftentimes the cause was sugar, too much sugar. And salt was the wrong white powder that was blamed opposed to sugar, based on the narrow-mindedness of a lot of nutritional studies, especially because there's a lot of funding involved there, a lot of, certain interest groups. Like example, if Kellogg's is funding a study, they'd rather you think that, 10 eggs are more harmful for you than 10 Oreos, right? I've said that phrase plenty of times on my page because I talk a lot about ketogenic dieting. I mean, I'm not trying to pick out at Kellogg's, but example, if I had a company, I would want you to think that it was unhealthy if I'm promoting it as healthy, right? So just, food for thought, but do your own research, because I don't make things political on this page. I simply talk about the research I performed and the facts. Now, salt water on a carb diet. You could sip it throughout the day, and what this will do, this is now what it's actually going to do to you. A lot of times, your body is trying to retain water and be hydrated, right? We all know that whole, your body's mostly water, 80% water, all this stuff, right? A lot of times, your body is craving hydration, and what it will do is you'll be hungry because your blood sugar and blood insulin are up because your salt is low. So oftentimes, if your sodium levels are low, what your body will do is it'll artificially raise up its insulin in order to help you retain water. So what this does is it makes you hungrier, because when your insulin's up, you're hungrier. It also turns off fat burning. That's what insulin does. It's an anabolic hormone. It wants to build things, and it turns off any catabolic processes like fat burning. So when you start to, get balanced amounts of sodium from the doses I'll explain, what you'll essentially get is you can kind of tame that volatile blood insulin, that volatile blood sugar, and give your body the hydration it needs, that it's also ultimately making you feel hungry for, because your sodium's low. So sometimes we'll get that craving for food because our body's just trying to hydrate you, and essentially, opposed to making you crave salt, you're craving food altogether because that insulin's up trying to retain the water and reinforce you to go out and get some food and hydrate yourself, because that's a very quick way to hydrate yourself, by eating something. So, because a lot of food is mostly water. So, when we're talking about using this in the context of if it fits your macros diet, you're going to use a lower dose of salt water than, the keto crowd, and a much lower dose than the fasting crowd. So up the top here, we have the fasting numbers of whatever dosage you would take for a prolonged fast. Then we have the keto numbers, and right down here is where you'll have the amount of quantity of electrolytes you'll be consuming when you're on if it's your macros or carb inclusive diet. So essentially, if you're doing a full prolonged fast, about 1 teaspoon of potassium chloride, so potassium salt, this is necessary. Don't argue on this, it has to be there. And sodium, so pink, good quality pink salt, not just, BS table salt. Essentially, you're going to want salt and potassium chloride. And what you do is, when you have these two, you put a teaspoon of each into 2 liters of water, and you sip it throughout a fast. Now, if you're doing keto, you're going to take a little bit lower than that. I'd say around, 60% of that, right? And if it's your macros, use about 1/4 of a teaspoon for each. Maybe you can get away with a little bit more, but you're going to have to sip this carefully, because you don't want to activate a salt flush. So this is essentially one thing you could do and sip on throughout the day. This is something I do for personal coaching clients, because what I want them to do is I want them to sip on this if they're doing a keto diet, because it will help retain those electrolyte levels and help retain the hydration and help prevent that blood sugar and insulin from spiking up and creating more hunger and less satisfaction and less fat burn. So this is a long diluted video, but what you need to know is sodium and potassium. And if you want to do it like the way Cole Robinson does from Snake Diet, he also puts in a little bit of sodium bicarbonate, which is baking soda, but that's more so for people who are producing ketones in their liver. So if you're not producing ketones, you don't really need that as much. But here's one thing you have to keep in mind. You can't just pick up an electrolyte supplement and do this. Well, you might be able to, but here's the reason why you might want to consider not doing that. Essentially, when you supplement with any electrolyte, you will deplete your stores of other electrolytes. So if you supplement with too much sodium, you'll deplete your levels of potassium, which is why you have them both in there. If you supplement with too much potassium, you'll have lowered magnesium, right? So essentially, don't just buy any random electrolyte supplement because, they're all the same, whatever. No, they're not all the same. And the most important ones for feeling hydrated and managing your blood sugar and insulin are going to be sodium, potassium. So that is the gist of this video. I wanted you to know everything that you have to know and nothing that you don't need to know for this video. It's very long and drawn out, but I try to be precise. Okay, that's the end of the video. Leave me a comment, like the video, subscribe to me right now. Let me know what else you want me to talk about. If there's any diet type of video you want me to make, let me know. And I want you to go to my other videos in this Any Diet playlist, because even though these tips work for any diet, ultimately, a lot of the mechanisms I've derived from my years of experimenting, and practicing and coaching the ketogenic diet and fasting. Because ultimately, those are some of the better ways to diet, in my opinion. It simply takes more startup effort to get into them. That is the unfortunate opposite side of the coin with them. So despite what your preconceived notions about keto might be, if you're not already somebody interested in this, take a look to it and look through my other Any Diet videos, because I still try to make things easier for people who aren't following those diets. But keep in mind, if you're watching these videos in the first place and you're not doing keto, it's probably because you're low-key unsatisfied with a diet that is trying to lose fat, but you're still satisfied or unsatisfied or whatever. And that's ultimately why I switched to keto in the first place, like 7+ years ago. So that's the end of the video. Go watch some more. Thank you. Peace.